right, we're joined live this hour by Lew Rosenbaum, a revolutionary, a writer, a poet, a keeper of the word, right? A bookkeeper, a shopkeeper, and I say that in the maximum amount of humility and reverence. Lew, can we start off this interview by talking about your time at the Midnight Special?
Sure. Well, I guess I should start a little bit before my time on the Midnight Special. The Midnight Special actually started right in the height of the anti-war sentiment in Los Angeles, the anti-Vietnam War sentiment. There were people at UCLA who were protesting against the war every day and standing out on Wilshire Boulevard in front of the Veterans Administration building. Big lines of them, and that's a huge block. And they were covering the line, that whole block, protesting the war. And no matter what they did to protest the war went on, and they couldn't figure out, how are they going to do something about this? It's not doing anything. I'm probably exaggerating a little bit, but one of the guys who was a physics student at UCLA wound up getting an old A.B. Dick mimeograph machine, and he started printing leaflets. And before long, they were printing books, and that became something called the Peace Press, which existed for quite some time. Published a number of very important books, and some of the folks who were involved in this formed the Midnight Special bookstore, and their thought was, if we're going to do something, we should do something to explain what's going on, not just to do something about it. And so their interest was in education, what we often referred to in those days as propaganda, still do actually. And but and they formed a collective that sold a lot of radical literature, mostly to begin with periodicals. A lot of it came from China. Some of it came from the Soviet Union. And before long, by the time I got involved in it, I was actually, I knew that it existed. I'd been there a few times. But by the time I was called to go there, I was distributing the People's Tribune newspaper and books from a publisher called Proletarian Press, which is no longer around. And we had a couple books that they were very interested in. And so they wanted to carry them in the store. So a couple of us went out to talk to these very serious revolutionaries who were really concerned, again, as I said, about explaining what was going on. And so they took our material, and within a week or so, they called back and said, "We've sold out." We didn't leave them a lot, but so I was back again, and before long we had a study group going there about what's going on in the world and all that kind of stuff. And then I began volunteering at the bookstore, and I was there from about the mid 70s till 1987 when I left for Chicago. So I had that roughly 12-year period in which the Midnight Special grew out of its little enclave in Venice, where nobody stumbled upon it unless they knew where it was, to the Santa Monica Mall, where it was really a center for political literature throughout the city. I don't want to underestimate what its importance was in Venice, because it was without a doubt the source of most political literature in the Southern California region, and actually by then throughout the country, because it had a distribution business that took it to all sorts of radical bookstores around the country. You have to think for a moment. I mean, Midnight Special is an important bookstore, no doubt about it, but you have to understand that the era that this came up in was so much stuff going on, so many ideas being roiled in the public, that there were bookstores everywhere that were asking for political literature, and they couldn't get it anyplace. And the Midnight Special became the source of a lot of that.
So what were some of the titles that were published at the time by Proletarian Press?
Well, the two that were the most popular was a book called The History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolshevik, or what we called it, the History of the CPSUB. It had been a textbook used in the Soviet Union in the 20s, and uh, it was used very widely in left literature at that time. But the other really popular book was a book on political economy, Introduction to Political Economy by Leontiev. People were studying that because Capital was very, very difficult. People were reading Capital as well. But Leontiev was sort of like what you might consider a Cliff Notes to Capital. I'm exaggerating some. So that was very popular, and we would sell out all the time. There was another book that we sold out of. It was a couple of years later that we published it, but it was a textbook of Marxist philosophy, book that was um, published in the Soviet Union originally, but all of these had gone out of print, I have to say. So we brought them back into print, and there were a number of books like that. Fascism and Social Revolution was another one by Dutt. Really important book about excuse me, specifically written for the rise of fascism in Europe. But we were looking at it in terms of the time that we were living in as well.
Yeah. So this is going to, potentially be seen by a wide cross section of people from various different, backgrounds and interests. Can you tell the audience a little bit about what the People's Tribune was and your involvement with the People's Tribune?
Sure. At that time, the People's Tribune was the newspaper of the Communist League. It was before a number of other organizations came out. It was a paper that started in Watts around the time of the Watts Rebellion of 1965, actually, and was published monthly. And it was a paper that we brought around to different bookstores and places like that. And so it dealt with a lot of basic issues that people were fighting around: police brutality, housing, some of the same issues that we're fighting around today. Question of health care, of education. The struggles at that time took a little different form than they take now, but the content was very much the same.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the formation of the California Communist League and how it becomes the Communist League and then later the Communist Labor Party? Like how did?
Well, I'll tell you a little bit about that. I want to say, first of all, I guess that you have to understand again that the times then were much different than they are now. It was a much more ideological time. It was a much more, there wasn't as much of although there was a lot of activity around the anti-war movement and around the liberation movements, there wasn't as much of a movement around the fight for basic needs as there is today. There wasn't as much of an upsurge of the working class as there is today. So it was a very ideological movement. And there were a number of different left organizations that came out of this period. I was lucky enough to be introduced early on to an organization that was very interested in not so much interested in the left movement and squabbling with the rest of the left, but really interested in what is the shape of the workers' movement to come. And that was essentially the beginning of the Communist League, which came out of the Watts Rebellion. I first met Nelson Peary, who was the leader or one of the leaders of this, at a meeting in East Los Angeles, actually. I was out of medical school, and at that time, probably, I think I was still a social worker. Yeah, I was. And I was attending meetings of the East Los Angeles Health Task Force. This was a coalition of organizations based in East Los Angeles, a number of different mass organizations. And to say mass organizations, I don't mean they were left at all. They were Alcoholics Anonymous, the Planned Parenthood, uh, East Los Angeles Retarded Children's, I can't remember now, ELARCA is what it was called. Um, a lot of health-based organizations that were really community organizations. And I was attending these meetings because I'd been a medical student and I was very interested in healthcare still and was part of that process. So this is like 1970. And the Chicano moratorium had just taken place. And the East Los Angeles Health Task Force was trying to come to grips with what are they going to do? How do we resolve this question? There was this massive uprising or massive march that was attacked by the police. And a lot of people had been hurt and all that. So I was at this meeting and I'm sitting in this room and this guy walks in, sits down in front of me, sort of dozes off during the meeting. And then as the meeting draws to a close, the guy who's running the meeting, his name was Jose Duarte, said, I'd like to introduce Brother Nelson Peary, who's come to talk to us from Watts. And so the guy who was sitting in front of me, who had been dozing during the meeting, got up and said he apologized. He'd just gotten off work as a bricklayer, but he'd come from Watts in order to express solidarity with the workers in East Los Angeles. The workers in Watts were sending had their own issues a few years earlier, the Watts Rebellion, and understood very well what was going on. So this is how I met Nelson, although I didn't know it at the time. A couple of years later, I was introduced to him, and it was that experience of solidarity of one section of workers to another that was very impressive to me and made a big impression. The Communist Labor Party, also the Communist League, made connections with people in other parts of the country. In San Francisco, there was a group of Muni drivers. In Detroit, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, and together with them and with others around the country, formed an organization called the Communist League, a national organization. Sometime later, there was pressure from a number of organizations who thought that there was time to form a political party. And I can't say that we were all enthusiastic about it, but it seemed like it was something we had to do. We had to be part of it. We had to be part of that process. And we became the Communist Labor Party and realized after, wasn't that long, I guess, but by the early 90s, that was no longer the form of organization that was necessary. That the kind of organization that we had been trained to form in the 1970s was now passé. As the motion began to develop toward a real working class movement, and particularly as we began to see more and more the question of automation take place, the end of labor power taking place, and consequently the end of the old forms of industrial organization, the forms of organization that were based in the 19th and 20th century. So we're saying this toward the end of the 20th century, that we're seeing that this is no longer tenable. And so we left that form and with others, formed another organization.
Right. So again, as a wide, variety of people see this, can you explain to our audience the difference structurally of an organization between a party and a league? These words "party" and "league" might seem interchangeable to most people, but what is the difference structurally?
Well, I think the best way we can talk about it is that the kind of organization that we were trained to form was a compact group of people whose idea of a communist organization or a revolutionary organization is to say, we've got these ideas. come join our ideas. Here we are, and we know what is necessary. Come join us. I think what we're talking about now is a massive social motion where all kinds of ideas are in play, where all kinds of activity is in play, and the where the kind of revolutionary situation we're approaching is a mass uprising without a sense of what is the enemy, a full sense anyway, of what is the enemy, what is their strategy, what is their tactic, how do we move forward? I think the movement itself is quite capable. I think, at this point, the movement itself is quite capable of defining tactics, quite capable of deciding how they're, whether to fight for expansion of Medicaid or this sort of thing. That's not the problem. The problem today is an overall understanding of the direction of history and what's possible. And that's different from what a political party was intended to do at that time. That's not to say that we don't foresee a necessity for some political party to form at some point, but a political party now is an expression of a of a class, of an economic class. It's not what you and I believe, but it's an expression of a class. And that's what the direction is going in now, is that, and I think the best way to look at that is that when I talked earlier about this question of automation and that sort of thing, that's creating a new class which has been expelled from capitalism. It's never going to find its way back in to become the old style of industrial worker or any kind of worker, really. It's not going to have a job any longer. So the question that it faces is, in this new environment, how do we make our demands met? How do we deal with this thing? And in order to do that, we have to have a political representative. That's much like what happened in the 1840s in this country, when the abolitionists, an ideological group, right? And a group that was trying to win people to their ideas. But in the late 1840s, when the question of slavery came really onto the practical agenda, then the question was posed in an entirely different way. And the workers in the North and some of the workers even in the South, and certainly the radical abolitionists, needed a political representative to fight for the end of slavery. That's what it was meant to do. What we're looking at today is the creation of some form of political party that's intended to end private property. That's fundamentally different from what we've had before, but it's very analogous to the fight at the end of the Civil War. I don't know whether that helps at all.
When we talk about, well, you place a lot of emphasis on this question of automation, and many people would say that the Industrial Revolution brought around these machines, and that's kind of like automation. That's kind of that. But so, can you really create what is the nodal line that we move from? Because we see the development of industry, and the machines keep improving and improving and improving and improving and improving. What is qualitatively different about automation, what we're describing, versus mechanization? Where's that line break?
It's a good point. It's a good question. Where that really ends is in particular, it's as the automation of the means of subsistence is carried out, because that is where the basis of the development of surplus value comes from. Um, what we're looking at is increasingly people being separated from jobs in making the manufacturing, but also harvesting and in education and in every other sphere, creating the means of subsistence. That means that those workers, and we're talking about the end of whole divisions of labor. It's not just individual jobs, but whole divisions of labor going away. That means that section of society no longer has access to that same means of subsistence that they used to produce. Why is that true? Because they're not getting paid any longer, and we're still living in a market economy. Now, now that's different from before, where in mechanization, which involved a form of automation at that time, but mechanization at that point created larger and larger means of production that employed more and more people, uh, even within its grasp. That's not happening any longer. Whoever gets thrown out of these basic means of subsistence gets tossed into part-time jobs, gig economy, and I'm going to become an entrepreneur, all this kind of garbage that doesn't get anywhere because it's also constantly being forced out of existence. So, and I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, to bring it to life, I was born in 1981, and so when I was born, the industrial economy was falling apart, it was collapsing, it was falling, it was crumbling like a crumb cake, right? But it was still kind of there. By the time I'm 10 or 12, I'm now being told that when I grow up, I have to prepare myself for no longer an industrial economy, but a service economy, right? About 10 years into my work career, I'm told the service economy is going the way of the industrial economy. Now I must prepare for the gig economy. So that's what I experienced being born in 81. Where I was born in 91, this would be even more intense. 2001, even more so. So we see is what I'm seeing and hearing from you, and observing my own life, is a clear pattern where we are today is not where we're going to be tomorrow, and where we are tomorrow will be for even further worse next week. So so if we see this, it's not a question of things falling apart. I mean, I'm really interested in like how this ends up playing out in the ideological sphere, where there's these kind of these arguments that Generation X, or the millennials, or whoever, are somehow incompetent, lazy, or whatever. But from what you're describing, they are entering into an economy that is increasingly precarious. It has nothing to do with like the personal qualities of the individual. They are entering into a
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And the thing is, what we're seeing, I think, is we're certainly seeing that they're not lazy. I mean, they're working twice as hard to get half as far. I mean, that's the problem. And the thing that is striking is that that there's plenty of work to do. There's plenty of contribution that people can make. The problem is that it isn't profit making. That's the problem. That it doesn't provide a profit for capital. And so they don't care about that shit. So, so I hear people talk about, for example, you know, what are all these? How are we going to get by? What are all these people going to do if there's all this automation? Well, I mean, I can think of thousands of things people could do as well as enjoy themselves, but I can think of thousands of things people could do. I mean, one of the, we are confronted by a climate catastrophe that's just overwhelming, and we're saying there's nothing to do, that there isn't a contribution people can make. This is nonsense. Now, whether you can make profit off it, that's another question. But there certainly is something to do. There's a coronavirus out there right now. Um, is there something we can do? Of course there is.
Yeah.
What we're dealing with is a society, a society that says that it has to be organized around the market. So when you have healthcare, you can only organize it in order to get just in time enough masks, just in time enough surgical gowns, just in time enough ventilators.
Yeah.
That's what you need because it's the market that demands this. Well, of course, it's not profitable to build 1,000 more or 1,000,000 more surgical masks than you need today, but maybe you need to do that anyway.
Right.
That's what we're talking about, it seems to me.
Yeah. So that leads into the question I have, and this is a question I've posed to many people, and I really want, and the answer is obvious, but like I'm interested in how people frame it, right? Kind of for posterity. And that question you've already kind of answered without me even posing it, but just maybe expand on it a little bit. Why is it that a market system cannot produce the necessary life-saving items in a pandemic?
Well, there's actually two or three reasons. One reason is the one I just said, which is that the market is essentially organized in order to fulfill things for whatever is the normal flow, and healthcare doesn't fit that normal flow. So it's okay for books, for the most part. Even books, there's a problem because if somebody suddenly breaks out in a bestseller, then they're caught, whatever. But that's not such a big deal. You can wait a week or two for a book. You can't wait a week or two for a ventilator when you need it. So that's one reason. The other reason is inherent in capitalism is an anarchy of production. Now that seems like a contradiction because when you go to any manufacturing plant, you see extreme planning taking place. I mean, you've got in front of you all these machines and maybe only robots, but you've got it planned to the nth degree of where they're getting the supply from and all this kind of stuff. So take a car manufacturer as an example. Okay, for Ford, for its SUVs, in their Ford plant, that's perfectly planned. And in the Chevy plant for their SUVs, it's perfectly planned. And in the in the Chrysler plant, it's perfectly planned. And they planned it so that they know that there's 2 million cars that are going to be bought this year that are SUVs. Do they sit back and say, well, Ford, you're going to take 500,000 of them, and Chrysler, you're going to take 500,000 of them, and GE, you're going to take 1,000,000 of them? No, they don't do that at all. They each think they're going to win the whole market. And then they forget that Toyota's also doing this. So that's anarchy of production. Yeah. So and you have the same thing going on elsewhere throughout the economy, and which is extremely redundant in places where you don't need it to be redundant. And I think that's that kind of explains the conundrum we're in the middle of. That's the third thing is that when you've got these three plants that are producing far too many cars, you can't in a capitalist economy, you can't unless you have extreme urgency like a war, and I mean a real war, not what Donald Trump thinks is a war, but a real war like World War II. You can't simply nationalize an industry and say, you're no longer going to be producing cars. You're going to be producing tanks. Or you're no longer going to be producing shirts. You're going to be producing surgical gowns. That's a little bit more like what we're confronting now. You can't do that. Not in a capitalist economy.
And yet we see...
Not in a capitalist economy, certainly not like what we've got. And that's why you have this stupid shit, like I'm asking these people to produce these gowns, and how wonderful they agreed to do it. And not only that, we're going to pay them to do it. We're going to pay them extra money to do it. And not only that, we're going to get California to bid against Illinois, to bid against New York. So the price goes up out of our pockets, of course.
Out of the public treasury. Yeah, I mean, out of the tax base. That's ridiculous. Um, that was so ridiculous. I think I forgot my next question. Oh, yeah. So I mean, yeah, we see in China, which there's certain market elements and certain things are not good, but still a somewhat centralized planned economy. They're able to build a hospital within 10 days. We see in Cuba, when Cuba is struck by hurricanes, they're able to get people out. And China's a pretty high technological base. Cuba less so, and yet when people are just geared to make a thing happen, the thing can happen. I mean, I think sometimes we overcomplicate it, but we're talking about waves of history. I mean, like, no, we're geared. We're not geared to make things happen, and it's totally potentially possible that we could re-gear society to make things happen.
Right. When we build a house here or a housing complex, we don't build a house to build a place for people to live. We build houses for people to make money. That's and that's true about any industry, of course. I got to tell you an anecdote here. So when I was working at Guild Books some years later after Midnight Special, there was a really wonderful guy. He was involved. He was a pest control worker, had his own company, and he'd go out but he would come in and buy books from Guild all the time. He'd buy all the latest Noam Chomsky book and the latest this and the latest that. And he was a very hyper sort of a guy. He'd come in and one day he just marched up to the front counter and said, "Lew, I gotta tell you, GM doesn't make cars. They don't make cars, they make money." I loved it. It's just wonderful. But it's true. It's really true. They don't make use values, they make exchange values. And that's the essence of what capitalism is. It makes exchange values. If its main purpose is use, forget about it. And that's really what we're facing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not possible for it to be another way.
Yeah.
No matter the intentions of a CEO, which I mean, you don't rise to the level of CEO without being a sociopath, but but let's say it were somehow possible, even if they had like a change of heart, like a what do you call it, like an Ebenezer Scrooge type, they're visited by several ghosts. Even if that were to happen, they can't. It cannot be done under this economic system. It simply cannot be done. And so we need a new economic system. And I'm editorializing now, but I mean,
yeah, that's kind of why it's very, very important in this, especially at this time, in this period, when people are actually beginning to talk about things like revolution. I mean, I can't overestimate the importance in 2016 of Bernie Sanders talking about political revolution and talking about socialism. I can't overestimate that, because it brought into the public discourse those words that had been out of favor for decades. Suddenly people were talking about these things. Partly that he was bringing it into the public discourse because it was actually grumbling at the grassroots too.
Right, and in order to bring it back into the Democratic Party, so we got to push beyond that.
But the thing is that the people who have the most hope for a Bernie Sanders presidency would learn the most from a Bernie Sanders presidency, because as soon as he would be, if he were able to be he's obviously not going to be on the Democratic nominee, but if he were going to be president, he would immediately be hamstrung by the social relations of the society and the political relations around him, the Democratic National Committee and all that shit that exists. So I think the thing that's important to understand is that there is a systemic problem here that we're going to have to deal with under any circumstances.
Yeah.
And we're beginning to understand that, it seems to me. More and more people are beginning to understand that. It's a very exciting time to live in, and to see that sort of thing happening.
I think in many ways the pandemic is making it naked the arbitrary nature of the
Absolutely.
economy. This, I mean,
Absolutely.
absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I was talking with a professor, and we had this conversation. We discussed capital, so we were discussing each section of capital, and we got to the section about the commodity fetish, and what I came up with was the idea that, okay, let's say there's a man outside a restaurant and a bear, right? Now the man knows there's a sandwich inside in behind the kitchen. You have to walk around the counter, get behind the kitchen, and there's the sandwich. You can eat it, right? And the bear knows it too. The bear walks directly in and eats the sandwich, right? The man instead goes into his car, pulls out a guitar, starts singing a song, right? So he can get some money so he can go buy the sandwich because because he's smart and the bear's dumb, right?
Yeah.
So and this is how we live our lives.
Yeah.
Well, look, it's been a pleasure. Is there anything that you can leave our audience with? Any links? Anything they should follow? Anything they should know about?
Um, well, I guess maybe I'd like to read a poem for you.
Oh, I'd love a poem. I'd love a poem. Let's hear
I
it.
got to get up from my seat here, and I hadn't thought about it, but let's do that. Just hope I got it here. I hope. Actually, I think. No. This is why I should have thought about this to begin with. Well, I guess what I should do, rather than reading my own, I'm going to read a Roky Dalton poem.
All
One
right.
of my favorites. It's called On Headaches. I think it carefully describes where we are. Roky Dalton writes, "To be a communist is a beautiful thing, although it causes many headaches. And the problem with communist headaches is, as we all know, historical. They don't yield to aspirin, only to the realization of paradise on earth. So it goes. Under capitalism, if our head aches, it gets chopped off. In the struggle for the revolution, the head is a time bomb. In the period of socialist construction, we plan headaches, which does not make them go away, quite the contrary. Communism will be, among other things, an aspirin the size of the sun." And I love that
Find
poem.
Power by Lew Rosenbaum. I thank you, Lou, for your time, and I'm sure we'll
Thank
be
you.
on the internet. Fair, Lou.
Take care.